In the late afternoon of December 28, 1941, Hartwell heard the boots coming down the corridor before he saw the shadow stop at the iron door, and the sensation that flooded through his chest was not quite fear yet, but something closer to the cold recognition that what he had been dreading for 3 days was finally about to begin. The cell had no windows, and the air tasted of rust and human waste, and the particular dampness that comes from concrete that never dries. Hartwell sat against the wall with his knees pulled up, his uniform torn at the shoulder, his dog tags missing, his hands still trembling from the march through Manila after the surrender. 23 years old, farm kid from Nebraska, radio operator. 3 weeks ago he had been transmitting coordinates from a hillside overlooking Lingayen Gulf, and now he was sitting in a converted warehouse that the Japanese had turned into a processing center for captured American and Filipino personnel, and the only thing he knew for certain was that the stories he had heard whispered in the transport trucks were worse than anything he had imagined war could be. The key turned. The door opened. The guard who entered was young, maybe younger than Hartwell, with a face that showed no expression at all, and behind him came an officer whose uniform was immaculate despite the heat, whose boots gleamed, whose sword hung at his side like a ceremonial object that had somehow remained untouched by the chaos of invasion. The officer said nothing. He looked at Hartwell the way someone might look at a piece of equipment that needed to be tested for functionality. Then he turned and left, and the guard gestured with his rifle, and Hartwell stood on legs that had gone numb from sitting and followed him into the corridor where the light was somehow worse than the darkness had been. What Hartwell had expected, what they had all expected in those first days after Bataan and Corregidor became untenable, was that capture would mean imprisonment, perhaps labor, perhaps hardship, but within a framework they understood. The Geneva Convention, Red Cross visits, letters home, prisoner exchanges, the orderly mechanisms of modern warfare between civilized nations. Even as the situation deteriorated and supplies dwindled and the orders became increasingly desperate, there remained among the American forces a kind of foundational assumption that surrender, while humiliating, would at least preserve life according to certain recognized rules. They had heard stories, of course, whispers about Chinese civilians, about incidents in Nanking, about cruelties that seemed too extreme to be true, but these were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration or the inevitable confusion of war reporting. Americans did not torture prisoners. Therefore, by some unspoken logic, neither did anyone else. Not really, not systematically, not as policy. The interrogation room was smaller than the cell, which somehow made it worse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a single bulb hanging from a wire. The concrete floor had stains that Hartwell tried not to examine too closely. The guard pushed him into the room and pointed at one of the chairs, and Hartwell sat. And then the waiting began. This was the first thing he learned, that the interrogation started long before anyone asked a question. It started in the silence. It started in the anticipation. It started in the way the room seemed to press in from all sides, and the way his own breathing sounded too loud, and the way every minute that passed felt like evidence that something worse was coming, something that required preparation, something that needed time to set up. He had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when Kincaid was brought in. Kincaid was older, maybe 35, a sergeant from Kentucky who had been in the cell next to Hartwell's, and the moment Hartwell saw his face, he knew that Kincaid had already been through this, had already been in this room, or one like it, had already experienced whatever it was that Hartwell was waiting to experience. Kincaid's left eye was swollen shut, his lower lip had been split, but it was not the visible injuries that communicated the horror. It was something in his posture, the way he held himself, the way he would not make eye contact, as if eye contact itself had become dangerous, as if looking directly at another person might trigger something that could not be stopped once it started. The guard pushed Kincaid toward the wall, and he stood there, swaying slightly, and then the officer returned, the same one from before, and this time he was carrying a folder. He sat down across from Hartwell and opened the folder and studied its contents with the careful attention of someone reviewing a technical manual. Then he looked up and spoke in English that was precise and formal and oddly inflectionless. He asked Hartwell's name, rank, serial number. Hartwell provided them. The officer wrote them down. Then he asked what unit Hartwell had served with, what equipment they had used, where they had been positioned, what orders they had received, who their commanders were, what the defensive plans had been, what supplies remained, what reinforcements were expected. Hartwell answered according to the training: name, rank, serial number, nothing more. The officer listened to each repetition of these 3 pieces of information and wrote nothing down and showed no reaction whatsoever. After perhaps the 10th question, the officer closed the folder and stood up and walked around the table until he was standing directly behind Hartwell's chair, close enough that Hartwell could hear him breathing, could smell the faint scent of tobacco and something else, maybe hair oil, and the proximity was deliberate, was calculated to create a specific kind of discomfort, and Hartwell forced himself to remain still, to keep his breathing steady, to not turn around. The officer said something in Japanese to the guard. The guard left. The room became quieter. The officer walked back around the table and sat down and looked at Hartwell with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. It was impossible to tell. And then he began to speak, not asking questions now, but explaining something. His voice never rising, never showing emotion, just delivering information in that same flat tone. He explained that the Emperor's forces did not recognize surrender as an honorable option. He explained that soldiers who surrendered had violated the most fundamental principle of military service and had therefore forfeited the protections that might otherwise be extended to prisoners of war. He explained that cooperation was not a choice, but an obligation, and that the methods used to ensure cooperation were limited only by the imagination and patience of the interrogators. He explained that American assumptions about civilized warfare were themselves evidence of weakness, of a fundamental misunderstanding of what war actually required, of a softness that made American soldiers inferior to Japanese soldiers in every meaningful way. He explained that pain was a teaching tool, that humiliation was a teaching tool, that the systematic destruction of dignity was a teaching tool, and that these tools would be applied with increasing precision until the prisoner learned what they needed to learn. Then he stood up and left, and Hartwell was alone with Kincaid, who had not moved from his position against the wall, who was staring at something on the floor, and the silence that followed felt more terrible than anything that had been said, because it was in that silence that Hartwell began to understand that the words had not been a threat, but a description, not a warning but a statement of fact, not something that might happen, but something that was already happening, that had been happening, that would continue to happen. Kincaid finally looked up and their eyes met, and what Hartwell saw in Kincaid's face was not defiance or courage or even fear, but something closer to resignation, a kind of hollowed-out acceptance that came from having already experienced what Hartwell was only beginning to imagine. The guard returned with 2 other soldiers, and they took Kincaid out, and then Hartwell was alone again, and the waiting resumed. And this time, the waiting was different, because now he knew what the waiting was for, knew that it was not simply a bureaucratic delay or a logistical problem, but a deliberate strategy, a way of letting the mind work on itself, of letting imagination do the work that would make the actual interrogation more effective. He thought about Kincaid's face. He thought about the stains on the floor. He thought about the officer's voice and the careful way he had pronounced each word and the complete absence of anger or passion or any human emotion that might suggest this was personal, that might suggest there was anything that could be appealed to or negotiated with. This was not cruelty in the conventional sense. This was method. This was system. This was something that had been refined and perfected and turned into a precise instrument, and the precision was what made it most frightening. Hours passed. The light did not change. His throat became dry. His back began to ache from sitting. The silence developed textures, layers, different qualities of absence. Sometimes he heard voices in the corridor, sometimes footsteps, sometimes sounds that might have been machinery or might have been something else, and each sound made him tense, made his heart rate accelerate, made the waiting somehow worse because each sound suggested that the waiting was about to end. But it did not end. It continued. And in that continuation he began to understand another lesson, that time itself could be weaponized, that uncertainty was its own form of torture, that not knowing when something would happen was in some ways worse than experiencing it, because the anticipation never resolved, never crystallized into something concrete that could be endured and survived. When they finally came for him again, it was not the same guards. These were different men, harder looking, older, with the kind of faces that suggested they had done this many times before, that this was routine work, that whatever was about to happen was simply another task to be completed. They took him down a different corridor, through a door he had not noticed before, into a room that was larger than the first, with different equipment, with a drain in the center of the floor, with hooks embedded in the ceiling, with a wooden frame that looked like it might be used for stretching canvas, but was clearly intended for something else. This was when the abstract terror became concrete. This was when the rumors he had heard in the trucks, the whispered stories that had seemed too extreme to be believed, suddenly became not just plausible, but inevitable. The technique they used first was water, not drowning, not exactly, but something more precise, more controlled, more sustainable over long periods. They bound his wrists to the frame, they tilted his head back, they placed a cloth over his face. Then they poured water slowly, steadily, creating a sensation that was not quite suffocation, but something close to it, something that triggered every primitive survival instinct simultaneously, that made the body believe it was dying even though the mind knew it was not, that created a panic so pure and overwhelming that thought itself became impossible. The water stopped. The cloth was removed. The officer asked a question. Hartwell gasped for air and could not speak, and the water began again, and this cycle repeated. And what made it unbearable was not any single instance, but the knowledge that it could continue indefinitely, that there was no natural endpoint, that the interrogators could sustain this for hours or days, or however long it took to break through whatever resistance remained. Between sessions they left him bound to the frame, head hanging forward, water dripping from his hair, his uniform soaked, his chest heaving, and in those intervals he discovered that the body's capacity for fear was far greater than he had ever imagined, that terror was not a single emotion, but a spectrum of sensations, each one worse than the last, each one revealing new depths of vulnerability. He tried to focus on his training. He tried to remember the rules, the protocols, the guidelines for resistance. But training was revealed as completely inadequate for this situation, not because he was weak or poorly prepared, but because the training had been designed for a different kind of interrogation, one based on leverage and negotiation and the calculation of costs and benefits, not for this systematic assault on the very foundations of human endurance. What they wanted, he gradually understood, was not actually information, or rather, the information was secondary to something else, something more fundamental. They wanted to demonstrate their complete control. They wanted to strip away every layer of identity, every source of pride, every defense mechanism, until what remained was pure animal submission. The questions about troop positions and supply lines and defensive strategies were almost incidental. The real interrogation was about power, about establishing a hierarchy so absolute that resistance became not just futile, but literally unthinkable. This was why they were so methodical, why they never showed anger or frustration, why they approached each session with the same careful deliberation. They were not trying to hurt him. They were trying to remake him. After what might have been 3 hours or 6 or 10, time having become impossible to measure, they took him back to his cell, and this time there were other prisoners there, men he had not seen before, some American, some Filipino, all of them bearing the marks of similar treatment. No one spoke. Speaking was dangerous. But in the silence they communicated anyway, through glances, through the way they positioned themselves in the limited space, through the careful maintenance of certain boundaries. There was a hierarchy among them already, Hartwell realized, based on seniority or rank, or simply on who had been there longest and survived. Brackett, a corporal from Texas, had been in the facility for almost 2 weeks. His hands shook continuously. His eyes moved constantly, never settling on anything, always watching the door, always calculating escape routes that did not exist. He was the one who explained, in whispers so quiet they were almost subliminal, what the others had learned. The Japanese did not see them as prisoners in the Western sense. They saw them as men who had chosen dishonor over death, and therefore as men who had no honor left to lose. This philosophical position had practical consequences. It meant that the normal restraints that might govern the treatment of captured enemies did not apply. It meant that any method, any technique, any form of physical or psychological pressure was permissible, even encouraged, because the subjects had already placed themselves outside the boundaries of human dignity by surrendering, and because the Japanese military culture placed such enormous emphasis on endurance, on the suppression of personal weakness, on the subordination of individual suffering to collective duty, they assumed that anyone who broke under interrogation was simply revealing their inherent inferiority, confirming the rightness of Japanese military supremacy. But there was more to it than philosophy, Brackett whispered. There was also anger. The war had not gone as the Japanese High Command had expected. American resistance had been fiercer than anticipated. Japanese casualties had been higher than predicted. The Emperor's forces had won the tactical victories, but at a cost that created pressure, that created frustration, that created a need for someone to blame. And the prisoners, as the physical embodiment of the enemy, became repositories for that frustration. The interrogations were not just about gathering intelligence. They were about revenge, about demonstration, about showing that despite the difficulties, despite the setbacks, Japanese power remained absolute and unchallengeable. The stories that circulated through the cells were worse than anything Hartwell had imagined. Men beaten to death for refusing to bow, men forced to kneel in the sun for days without water, men subjected to techniques that combined physical pain with psychological humiliation in ways specifically designed to maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of death, because a dead prisoner provided no more information and no more opportunities for demonstration. There were rumors about medical experiments, about prisoners used to test new methods of interrogation, about officers who competed to see who could break a prisoner fastest or most completely. Some of these stories were certainly exaggerated, amplified by fear and repetition, but enough of them were verifiable, confirmed by men who had witnessed them directly, that the overall picture they created was undeniable. What terrified the prisoners most was not the pain itself, but the arbitrariness. There was no clear correlation between cooperation and survival. Men who answered questions were treated no better than men who remained silent. Men who revealed everything they knew were subjected to continued interrogation because the interrogators assumed they were still holding something back. The randomness of it, the sense that nothing they did mattered, that their fate was determined by factors entirely beyond their control, created a kind of helplessness that was more crushing than any physical torture. At least in combat, there was the illusion of agency, the sense that courage or skill or luck might make a difference. Here there was nothing, just the waiting and the certainty that the waiting would end badly, and the knowledge that enduring one session only meant there would be another. Hartwell was taken again the next day, and this time the technique was different. They made him stand with his arms extended, holding a heavy piece of wood at shoulder height, and the guards stood beside him with a bamboo rod and struck him across the shoulders whenever the wood began to drop. This sounds almost benign compared to water or beatings, but the genius of it was in the duration. After 10 minutes, the muscles began to burn. After 20 minutes, the burning became excruciating. After 30 minutes, the arms began to shake uncontrollably, And still the guard stood there, expressionless, striking him whenever the wood dropped below the required height, and the officer sat behind the table asking questions in that same flat voice, and the lesson was clear. Your body will betray you. Your strength is finite. Your endurance has limits, and we can push you past those limits any time we choose. When he finally collapsed, when his arms simply refused to function anymore, and the wood clattered to the floor, they did not help him up. They let him lie there, gasping, unable to move his arms, and the officer came around the table and squatted beside him, and explained very patiently that this was what happened when prisoners were stubborn, when they refused to understand their situation, when they clung to outdated notions of duty and honor that had no meaning in their current circumstances. Then they dragged him back to his cell and left him there, and for the next several hours he could not lift his arms above his waist, could not feed himself, could not even adjust his position without help from the other prisoners. And this helplessness was the point, this reduction to complete dependency, this demonstration that even the most basic physical functions could be taken away. The stories spread beyond the facility, carried by prisoners who were transferred to work camps or holding areas, by guards who gossiped with other guards, by officers who filed reports that circulated through the command structure. American forces still fighting in the Philippines heard rumors about what was happening to captured men, and these rumors had effects that rippled outward in unpredictable ways. Some men became more determined to fight to the death rather than surrender. Others became more willing to contemplate alternatives that would have seemed unthinkable weeks before. The psychological impact of knowing what capture meant, of understanding that surrender did not lead to safety, but to systematic destruction, changed calculations, altered decision-making, created a desperate quality to the fighting that might not otherwise have existed. In other camps, in other facilities across the Pacific, similar patterns were emerging. American pilots shot down over Japanese-controlled territory. Sailors pulled from the water after their ships were sunk. Marines captured during island assaults. Each group discovered the same truths, learned the same lessons, developed the same techniques for psychological survival. Some men dissociated, created mental spaces where they could retreat when the physical reality became unbearable. Some men formed intense bonds with other prisoners, finding in collective endurance what they could not find individually. Some men broke completely, became collaborators or informants, and these men were despised but also pitied because everyone understood how thin the line was, how easily any of them might cross it. Mercer, who had been a supply officer before capture, developed a method he shared with others. He explained that the key was to separate the self from the body, to think of the body as an object that was experiencing pain, but that pain did not have to define the essential self. He taught men to focus on memories, to reconstruct in precise detail moments from their lives before the war, to build internal worlds so complete and absorbing that they could inhabit them even while their bodies were being tortured. It did not always work. Sometimes the pain was too overwhelming, too consuming, to permit any kind of mental escape. But sometimes it did work, and men survived interrogations they should not have survived, and when they talked about it afterward, they credited Mercer's technique with saving them, with giving them a tool that their training had never provided. The Japanese interrogators learned too, adapted their methods based on what worked and what did not, shared techniques across units, refined their approach with the same systematic attention they applied to other aspects of military operations. They discovered that American prisoners responded differently than Chinese or Filipino prisoners, that cultural assumptions about masculinity and honor created specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that shame was often more effective than pain, that the threat of harm to fellow prisoners could break men who remained defiant under personal torture. They kept records, documented results, turned interrogation into a science with protocols and best practices and measurable outcomes. By early 1942, as more American forces surrendered in the Philippines and elsewhere, the patterns were well established. Prisoners knew what to expect. They had heard the stories. They had received the whispered warnings from men who had endured and survived. But knowing did not make it easier. If anything, knowing made it worse, because the anticipation became its own form of torture, because the mind could imagine in advance what was coming, because there was no hope of discovering that the reality was less terrible than the rumors suggested. The reality was almost always worse. The rumors, even the most extreme ones, could not fully capture the sustained intensity of it, the way it continued day after day, the way the interrogators never seemed to tire or lose focus, the way the system ground on with relentless efficiency. Hartwell's interrogations continued for 3 weeks. The techniques varied, sometimes water, sometimes beating, sometimes stress positions, sometimes sleep deprivation, sometimes all of them in combination or in rapid succession. The questions remained largely the same, and his answers remained largely the same. And at some point he realized that the information itself had become almost irrelevant, that what was happening now was just the continuation of a process that had taken on its own momentum, that would continue until the interrogators decided it should stop, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything Hartwell did or said. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant he could stop trying to calculate the right response, could stop believing that his choices mattered. Terrifying because it meant he was completely powerless, completely at the mercy of forces beyond his control or understanding. Other prisoners were not as fortunate. Bywater, a young private from Oregon, died during his second interrogation session, his heart simply giving out under the combined stress of dehydration, exhaustion, and pain. The guards removed his body with the same efficiency they brought to everything else, and no explanation was provided, and his name was never mentioned again by the Japanese, though the prisoners spoke of him in whispers, as a reminder of how fragile the line was, how easily any of them might cross from endurance to collapse. Hollister, a lieutenant who had commanded a gun battery, went insane, his mind fracturing under the pressure, and he spent his remaining days in a corner of the cell speaking to people who were not there, reliving battles that had happened or had not happened, his grip on reality dissolved beyond recovery. The wider impact on American forces was difficult to measure but undeniable. Intelligence reports documented it, psychological assessments noted it, commanders saw it in the behavior of their men. There was a hardness that developed, a willingness to take risks that would have seemed reckless earlier in the war, a determination not to be captured that manifested in last-stand defenses and suicide missions, and fighting that continued long past the point where surrender would have been the rational choice. The stories of what the Japanese did to prisoners became a form of motivation, a reason to keep fighting even when the situation appeared hopeless, because the alternative to fighting was worse than death, was something that unmade men from the inside out, was a fate that erased not just life, but dignity and sanity and every quality that made existence bearable. Japanese commanders noticed this change and interpreted it according to their own framework. They saw it as evidence of American desperation, of the enemy's realization that they could not win, of the inevitable collapse that would follow once American forces understood the full superiority of Japanese military power. They did not recognize that their treatment of prisoners was creating exactly the kind of resistance they claimed to despise, was hardening American resolve in ways that diplomatic pressure or military setbacks alone could never have achieved. The cruelty was counterproductive from a strategic perspective, but it continued because it served other purposes, because it satisfied other needs, because the military culture that produced it could not easily be reformed or redirected. In the cell at night, when the electric light was finally switched off and the darkness became complete, Hartwell lay on the concrete floor and listened to the breathing of the other prisoners, and thought about home, about Nebraska, about the farm where he had grown up, about the radio equipment he had built as a teenager, about the ordinary peacetime world that now seemed impossibly distant, impossibly fragile, impossibly precious. He thought about what he would say if he ever had the chance to tell people what had happened here, how he would explain it, whether anyone would believe him or understand him, or recognize in his words the truth of what he had experienced. He thought about the officer with the flat voice and the careful pronunciation, and wondered what kind of training could produce such methodical cruelty, What kind of culture could normalize such behavior? What kind of war could turn human beings into precise instruments of suffering? The interrogations eventually stopped, not because Hartwell broke or cooperated, but because the interrogators moved on to newer prisoners, to men who had more recent information, to subjects who had not yet been processed through the system. Hartwell was transferred to a work camp where the conditions were different but no better, where starvation replaced torture as the primary threat, where disease and exhaustion killed men as efficiently as interrogation had. But he survived, as did Kincaid and Brackett and Mercer and some of the others, and they carried with them the knowledge of what had happened, the memory of those weeks in Manila, the understanding that war contained depths of cruelty that peacetime imagination could not fathom. Years later, after the war ended and the prisoners were liberated and the trials began and the world learned what had been done in the camps and facilities across the Pacific, people would struggle to comprehend it, would ask how such things could have happened, would search for explanations in culture or ideology or military necessity. But for those who had experienced it directly, the explanations were less important than the memory itself, the scar tissue that remained, the knowledge that human beings under certain conditions could become something monstrous, something that reduced other human beings to raw material for experiments in power and control. Hartwell never spoke much about it afterward, never wrote memoirs or gave interviews or sought recognition for having endured. But sometimes at night, he would wake from dreams that took him back to that room, to that table, to that officer with the flat voice, and he would lie in the darkness of his American bedroom and remember what terror felt like, remember what it meant to be completely powerless, remember that civilization was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. On a humid afternoon in the summer of 1945, when news of the Japanese surrender reached the camps, and the guards abandoned their posts and the prisoners walked out into sunlight they had not seen in years, Hartwell stood at the gate and looked back at the building where he had been interrogated and felt nothing at all, no triumph, no relief, no satisfaction, just a vast emptiness where emotions should have been. And he understood that what had been taken from him in that room could never be fully recovered, that the person who walked through that gate was not the same person who had entered it 3.5 years before, that the war had ended, but its effects would continue indefinitely, echoing through decades of nightmares and silences, and moments of sudden panic triggered by sounds or smells or the particular quality of light in a windowless room,